Okay, so hello everyone. Hello, geeks. Thank you for being here, and above all, thank you so much to Giulia Laco, today's guest, for being here with us. And I met, just a brief background on how I met. Giulia. I met her at the WordCamp in Verona back in October, so in Italy, and Giulia is Italian, so am I. And Giulia gave an absolutely astoundingly great presentation on the evolution of web typography. Let me just say something here. There's a comment that I need to reply to. Again, it's just so that everybody sees it. Yeah, here we go. So yes, so we met and we found immediately that we have quite a bit in common, because both of us started when the web. Giulia is really a pioneer, because I started in publishing and then got to working on the web much later, whereas Giulia started much earlier, and I I'm in awe of how much she's done. And but like me, she's got a background in humanities, so we immediately realized that we probably had quite a lot in common. And then I absolutely loved the presentation, because it went into the history of web typography, which to me is brilliant, because I love history in general. That's what I studied, and I love it. So and then also when she went on to talk about variable fonts, which is today's new kid on the block, and it was so interesting, and I learned so much. So I thought I couldn't wait to have her here. And now back to you, Giulia. So if you want to tell everybody who you are, and so that we find out more about you.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Piccia, for having me here. And as you said, I'm very happy to have met you, because we realized we had a lot of common and the same vision of the web, maybe starting from humanities and so on. As you said before, I've started programming, coding HTML on 1995, so it was quite early.
Yeah. I was still quite scared of the web at that time.
It was really the beginning, and it changed my let's say my career. I started on becoming a web something at that time. And now I don't know if I am a web what I am now, since had so many titles, let's say so, with the prefix of web, you see. Yeah. So let's say I'm a sort of web designer, developer, and marketer sometimes. And nowadays I'm a web typographer, let's say so, because I fell in love with typography a few years ago, actually, not from the beginning. Maybe because I didn't, on the web, there wasn't the possibility to use the fonts, but yeah, there were possibility to style in some way the content, to give it some hierarchy, and so the need for typography was there. Maybe there weren't the fonts, but there was typography.
Definitely, because also one thing that I think it's always worth reminding ourselves is that actually the web hierarchies, the headings, the names of the sections of the web page and so on, they all come from typesetting. They come from newspapers, really, article and header and everything. It all comes from print, and in fact, the very early websites all looked like newspapers, and they were all done, actually usually started by journalists, because it was about content. So typography is in fact essential to web design. It's absolutely crucial. It's 90% of what's on the web is it's words, it's typography. So it's so important.
So I agree. What can I say? I agree.
I thought so.
Nowadays, it's really everywhere, and web fonts are everywhere because they are on websites, they are on apps, on ebooks, maybe AMP pages, and HTML5 ads, and HTML emails as well. So we have web fonts everywhere, but it's something new in the history of the web, in all these digital products as well. And on websites, I believe that nowadays we have more or less 70% of websites that have web fonts, and we better describe what we mean by web fonts.
Yeah, I was going to say, because just the definition of web fonts. Can I just say that to me also, one really great thing that's happened with web fonts is that as a designer, for me at the beginning, I didn't like designing websites. I mean, I started getting into the web fairly recently, only like sort of maybe 6 or 7 years ago. But before that, I didn't like designing for the web because I hated the choice of typography. So of course I started getting excited when I realized that I could use at font face, and then with web fonts, obviously so much better. But yeah, so if, by the way, I just wanted to say quickly that if you have questions or comments, please use the comment box. So you'll forgive me. So we've got, okay, there are a few comments here. Hey, Jean-François Piyush Akash, thank you for being here, everyone. But just to say, if you have comments, I will, occasionally I will look like I'm not paying attention, but that's not true. I'm just checking the other screens to see if there are any comments. So please do comment if you have or ask any questions. Yes, and sorry, back to you, Giulia, on web fonts. Yes, what are the definition of web fonts?
Yes, web fonts are fonts at this server level, not at the client level. Because maybe a web designer that starts today might think that web fonts is the only way to have fonts on the web, but it's not. There was an era that I'd like to call of font agnosticism, something like that, when web designers couldn't know which font will be seen on the client's machines.
Yeah.
So you just bet what it was.
It was a horrible time. Yeah.
Yes, but because websites relied on fonts on each client machine. So it was an era where we had only computers basically connected to the internet and not mobile devices or everything, Internet of Things, And it was quite simple to have an idea of which set of fonts were common in different operating systems. You had Windows, Mac, Unix, maybe, and that was all, more or less. So you could share a sort of a number of web-safe fonts, they were called. So they were system fonts that were probably on every machine. Yeah. And so the web designer those days used a font stack that was a list of desiderata, let's say, to have on the site. And so you said, for example, okay, browser of my visitors, please use Helvetica Neue if you find it, otherwise use Arial, or otherwise use a sans serif font you can find on that computer. Now
that was a nightmare. I just couldn't believe it. It was like, no, I don't know. That's terrible. No, I can't bear it, because I loved my fonts so much. So yeah, it was hard. I found it really hard.
And it was exactly what happened to a lot of people those days. And the typographic needs of the web designers were solved basically by Photoshop. You ended up building some titles, some menus with Photoshop and cutting some small GIFs or JPEGs, and you use that in your design, because maybe that font that you used there was related to your project.
And I used to, those were the fights that I used to have with the developers I used to work with, because I would always insist on using, wherever possible, photoshopped fonts, and they were like, no, you can't do that, you can't do that, that's wrong, it's going to slow things down, it needs to be a font. I don't think anyone ever mentioned SEO at that time, but that was the typical, heated conversation that I would have with developers. And the thing is, as I've said in another post, they were right, of course, but they were also wrong, because sometimes it wasn't me just being an annoying designer. Sometimes the typography does matter. It matters for the brand, it matters for the style of message, it matters for the tone of voice. It does matter. So yes, they were right, but I was also right. But technically they were right. But in terms of other, a more sort of wider conversation, I was right too. So yeah, it was hard. Yeah.
A lot of people those days were really happy about Flash. Can you remember Flash technology?
Exactly.
That permitted to use some fonts you had, and then build some pages with typography there. But it was completely useless for SEO at that time. I've seen a lot of projects that had a version of the website in Flash and another version in HTML. So it was very difficult to maintain a site like that. One for people and one for a machine, more or less.
Wow. And that's also why website design was so expensive, so much more difficult and so much more complicated. Yeah.
Yes, it was. But actually, the W3C, the World Wide Web Consortium, was quite ready to study new ways to implement a different way of thinking at the web, different from Flash, for example, or other proprietary technologies, custom technologies. And they invented the CSS. The CSS, the first CSS specification, I believe it's from 1996, but it wasn't implemented at that time by the basic browsers. There was the browsers wars.
Of course,
So web browsers themselves tried to invent some tags, some HTML tags that weren't standard. So trying to have more users because of new tags they had. And there was the movement of the web standards that tried to convince every web designer around the world to code the standard code and not following the browser, optimized for, let's say, one browser you like. Not that attitude, but that's a proper standard HTML, XHTML. Jeffrey Zeldman, there was one of
yes, thank God. Yeah, he was. Yeah,
Molly Horse. I cannot pronounce her name. Molly. She was
Molly. Yes.
Molly. And after, after that period of CSS was a really good idea, in my opinion, because it was the first mean to that permitted to separate presentation from content, not from structure, but presentation and content were for the first time separated. Before in the HTML there was the tag font, it was inside the HTML, so there wasn't this separation. But it took a lot of years to have a very good implementation on CSS.
Yeah.
And let's say that in 1998, the headphone face was introduced by the W3C, but it took at least 10 years to be implemented. It was 98, but in 98, CSS was not so good everywhere.
Yeah.
And in 10 years, there were three technologies that were developed. Very curious technologies, Qfont, Fleer, Cipher. They were a mixture of JavaScript, sometimes Flash, another technique that tried to put some fonts on the web. But it was really difficult to have it for...
I don't even know what they are. Your talk was the first time I heard of it. I didn't know that these technologies existed. I don't know what they were.
I've seen it, but I never used them because it was too difficult to use them, and there was no point, in my opinion, at that time. And one of the reasons of I believe that the reason they didn't succeed was basically because of licensing. It was only with the Typekit in 2009 that the problem of license, of web font license, was solved.
Yeah.
What do I mean? If you take a font that is made by a font designer, it takes a lot of hours of work to have a good font, and then you put it on a server in order to have a web font. You expose it to piracy. And the web font, the font industry, the typography industry didn't want to become like the music industry.
Yeah, because also it was relatively easy, still is, to copy fonts. You could have functioned for years without actually ever paying for a font and having really nice fonts. It was really, really easy. And then if you move that to the web, that's really not fair, because as we know, as anyone who designs websites or has ever, sold photographs and so on, there still is the concept that anything that you find on the web is free, first of all. So, well, I found it on Google. Can you use that photo? Yeah, it was on Google, so go and use it. And then so that applies to fonts as well. And I know for a fact that talking to clients is something. I mean, thank God for Typekit, because for my clients, I just use my Typekit subscription, but not for every client is it easy to understand that you need to pay for a font. They just think, oh, it's a font, just type with it. It can't. How does it have a price? And so you need to explain to them. And of course, it was a real issue, and definitely at FontFace was a big issue, the licensing.
Yes, and nowadays you said it. Just Googling and you'll find a font. Nowadays, most of paid fonts are on GitHub. There are a lot of paid fonts on GitHub because people don't realize that they put licensed software there, and that's a big problem.
Yeah.
Going on the history of or the evolution, let's say, so web typography. In 2010, we had Google Fonts, and Google Fonts was really a game changer, a second game changer, because it was a very easy way to apply web fonts, open source web fonts on every website. And people that started to develop and build a website after 2010 tend to have the idea that the universe of fonts is Google Fonts.
Yeah.
If it's not on Google Fonts, it doesn't exist.
Yeah.
It's not like that. You can confirm, I guess.
Definitely.
But with great powers come great responsibilities. And the problem with web fonts was the weight, because each font you put on the server, in order to be seen on the user's sites, must be downloaded by them, and it has a weight.
Of course.
Some people tend to think that, okay, I'll put one font more and one image less, so the weight is more or less the same.
Yeah.
But that's not the case, because web fonts are blocking technology. I mean, if you put an image on a web page, it's downloaded whenever the band.
Whenever you visualize it.
Let's say so. It's lazy loading, more or less.
Yes.
So
exactly.
The image is not a real problem, whereas web font is blocking everything, the text, and that's going to be a very good problem.
Yeah.
That a lot of big companies with big sites, such as booking.com, GitHub itself, and some others, were really worried about this problem and the banned usage. And so in 2015, there was a sort of movement of these big players and they reached the idea of UI system fonts, giving up with web fonts, custom web fonts on their website, and going back to UI system fonts that are a sort of going back to the past. They weren't the same thing that system fonts, so they weren't Helvetica, Arial, and so on, but they were the font that used in the operating system of that you are using. For example, you had Roboto for Android, and you had San Francisco for Mac systems, and so on. And it was a good idea for sometimes. For example, in GitHub is a wonderful idea, because GitHub is a website for developers.
Yeah.
A developer is interested into the code, and it's not interested in the shape that the code has.
They're typically not interested in what it looks like. Typically, not every developer, but many developers, yes.
But they are looking, if you are watching using GitHub, they are looking for code. And so they're using a system, and they are accustomed to that system. And so if they see the code on the site they visit is visualized with the UI system font of their system, it's okay.
Yeah.
So
they're very happy.
Good idea. No problem of bandwidth. It's very fast. Every developer has the code, and that's all. But for all the other websites where we have brands and the typography needs are important, relevant, that's not a good idea, in my opinion. And so it's, I think it will be for few projects. It will be okay for few projects, but not for every project. And I guess that web fonts will go on to be used everywhere, especially because of the new revolution of variable fonts.
Here we are. That's the hero of the story. Yes.
That's a really good, a real good revolution, let's say, because they're going to stay, because the history of variable fonts dates back to 2016. At the end of 2016, they were announced in a typography conference, and it was an agreement between big players. There were Adobe, Google, Apple, and Microsoft. A little bit. If 4 big players like that agree on a standard, it's going to be a standard, and very soon. And that's what's happening. And a lot of other companies agreed on this standard. It was a standard that was tried before by Adobe, I don't know how many years before, but they didn't succeed at that time. What they are, to understand what they are, it's really important to understand the difference between typeface and font. Maybe not everybody realizes that typeface is a family of fonts, and a font is a single file. For example, typeface is Roboto, whereas Roboto regular, Roboto thin, Roboto italic, etc. are single fonts. Yeah. And
so every weight, what's it called, whether it's normal or italic, and if it's bold, italic, those are the fonts. That's the really important difference. And actually not that many people know about that, but it really is essential, as you say. So typeface is the whole family. It includes every single manifestation of Roboto. Roboto bold, italic, thin, normal, and so on. Those are the fonts. Yeah.
Yes. Of course, speaking about digital fonts, because if we think about the past, fonts were the metal types, and each metal type had a dimension. So the name of each font.
Absolutely. Every size, also every point size was a font. Yeah.
And that's what we are going to bring back with variable fonts, and especially with optical size in variable fonts. It's difficult to understand, but when you understand how it's working, it's a really big revolution in typography. In the past, the need of different metal types for different sizes these sizes were different to reach the ideal of readability. For example, a metal tie was cut in with strokes of a certain dimension in a small size in order to be read on a particular kind of paper. And for headings, we had big metal types or wood types as well. And they were made differently because of the dimension.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what we need nowadays in digital, because we had the same problem that they had with the paper. And for example, we can have very small text on a watch and a very big header in a blog post on a 27 inches screen, for example.
It's usually me. It's crazy if you think about it, that it's actually fairly recent that we have all these other types of screen, because for a long time it was just desktop, a laptop. Yeah, there was also laptop, but it was relatively big screens, because in comparison with a watch, a laptop is big. And now we have so many different types of supports and screens. Yeah.
Screen formats, proportions, proportional rate.
Yeah. Even
rounded corners, what else?
Even type of screen, because the technology, the screen technology is different from in readers, e-readers such as the Kindle or the Kobo, and in in other devices. So there's even that to take into consideration.
It's also on the rendering of fonts. It depends on basically the operating system. Sometimes in the same operating system you have two rendering engines.
Yeah.
So it depends on the browser you're using and the techniques to have the alias, the anti-alias of the font. It means meaning when you have the let's say the from vector to raster,
yes,
to bitmap in that rendering engine changes and it changes the technique if you're using grayscale anti-aliasing or how is it called, using the RGB rectangles of the pixels. So it's sub-pixel anti-aliasing. You have grayscale or sub-pixel. And it depends on mobile phones. For example, you can't have sub-pixel anti-aliasing because you rotate the screen, and so this rectangular can't be the same if you rotate it. So a lot of technology in our small devices, a lot, and a lot of things are happening when a device is rendering a font. And with variable fonts, the device will have a lot of information more. What what is variable font? It's a format very similar to the kind of format we are used. So it's open type format, OTF.
Yeah.
And has a new, someone says that a variable font can be defined as a font that behaves like many fonts, meaning that a variable font is a sort of family, typeface family, and has inside the information that are able to describe the single weights, the single, for example, the Roman, the bold, the italics, different weights. But weight is only one of the axes because every variable font has a lot of axes. 5 are the basic axes used, that are basically the axes used by type designers to build the different kind of weight of styles. For example, it's weight, it's the width, so it can be condensed or the contrary.
Extended.
Thank you. Yeah. Or it can be slant, with an angle of slanting, or it can be italic, and that's very other big story.
In case people don't know, an italic font is not just slanted, it changes. It's not just the same font on an angle. It's the letters usually change quite substantially with italics. So it's not italics and slanted, not the same thing, just so that everyone knows.
And none of them has anything to do with faux italics and faux slant, faux italics as well.
Just to make it easier.
Because faux, meaning false in French, is what a browser does to a font. If a browser has a web font, but only the regular font and not the italic, the proper italic one. So you upload, I don't know, Roboto regular, and you don't upload a Roboto italic. And
but you call it.
Pardon?
And then you call it CSS.
Yes, in CSS. The CSS, in the CSS, you specify that you want that paragraph in italic. The browser will build his own version of italic, and that's called the faux bold, and that's considered a typographic crime, right? Because what you end up seeing is very different from what it's meant to be the italic version.
Intended, when when they created the font,
And speaking about variable fonts, it's not always easy for a type designer to build a variable font that has both the regular version and the italic version of it in the same variable font. Sometimes the reason is because there's a rule in building a variable font. For example, let's take an A. An A is a vector, is described by a vector, and you have some points that describe the shape. And the type designer should map on one axis you have, for example, the way, I would need an image maybe to explain that better. But you have to map the same point from one version to from one side of an axis to the other side of the axis. So if the regular A and the italic A are really different, there's no way to put those points in order to transform one from the other.
I
so
see.
You can't do one single variable font for these two so different typefaces. So I'm sure they will end up doing two versions of that variable font. So you'll have, I guess, the variable font and the italic variable font. Maybe you've got two because they're so different. That's especially, this will be, I guess, true in the future when classical fonts will be transformed into variable fonts.
So do you think that every single classical font will be transformed into a variable font in, with time, over the course of time?
Not every classical font, but the most used, I'm sure they will. They are the big distributors of fonts, Monotype, Typekit, people like that are working on this, on technologies that try to convert all their fonts into variable fonts.
Right.
I'm not so sure they already have an idea, a precise idea of how to sell variable fonts.
Yeah, because that's going to introduce further licensing problems, isn't it? In a way.
Especially because of the pricing.
Yeah.
Because if nowadays, if you buy an entire family of, let's say, 16 weights, you're going to pay a lot. Whereas if you'll have a variable font, it will be like having an entire family of fonts at your disposal and more. It will be very lighter, very much lighter than the entire family in terms of bytes, but it will be very
so in terms of the work that the designer has to put in,
exactly,
it will be even more, won't it? Because they have to calculate, because I know that the point, I know that we said that I don't particularly like to share slides on this one, but maybe will because when I do these talks, because they're meant to be talks rather than presentations, but there is actually a really interesting slide from your presentation that I might share now, because there's going to be much more that we will be able to do with variable fonts, isn't there? Like almost deformations and animations even.
It's all to be discovered. I mean, it's really open.
So if I'm just going to share this slide because I'm really curious. So I think, and there's a really interesting comment from Belinda who says then in one of her first jobs, she had to hand draw custom type on packaging for computer games as they wanted a totally unique look for the brands. Hand drawing type really does educate you about lesser font design. So I think that after you've hand drawn type, you will never complain about the price of a font again.
Probably. Definitely.
So I'm just quickly going to share this slide because and we can describe it. But I just because it's so. So can you see it? The basically you have the variable font here, and then all the things that you can change about that variable font. And it's things that we're not used to seeing. We don't know what they are. I mean, width, weight, X height, I mean, weight you can change, but usually I can't change the X height on a font that I'm using. I can't change the width, and also serif, para weight, para width, optical size, grade, contrast. There is so much, you know, so much more than what we're used to.
It won't be the same on each variable font. Each designer can choose how many axes will expose to the user. The user in this case is the web designer or the designer that uses the font. So there are 5 axes that are considered the traditional axes. The one I mentioned before. So it's weight, width, italic, slant, and optical size. But there's no limit on the numbers of axes that a designer, a font designer, can put into the font and expose to the user. And there are a lot of very interesting experiments going on. David Jonathan Ross is one famous font designer that is doing things very impressive on that, and a lot of others. Here I can see Amstel var variable font has a lot of axes. If you're curious, go to axispraxis.com or v-fonts.com. There are 2 websites that in which you can see some
I'm gonna put it in the
fonts, and
Axis,
you can
Axis
they are
Praxis.
playgrounds. Axispraxis.com.
Axispraxis.com. Yeah, I've been here, and it's fun. It's crazy. Yeah.
And minus-fonts.com as well is a very there are a lot of coming now.
Yeah. I've been playing with them. I really recommend that you go and play, because it's extraordinary. Yeah, it just shows you what can be done.
And for example, there are the possibilities are really impressive. Pimentel, I've heard him saying something about this dyslexia and the possibility, for example, to change the terminals of variable fonts. And if you let that possibility to the user, let's say so, maybe that helps people with dyslexia problems to better read text. Or, for example, you can change the ascenders dimension or descender dimension, things like that. You can improve your legibility and readability of your font, and that's impressive, in my opinion.
It's amazing.
And there are a lot of possibilities. For example, consider every device we have nowadays has the mobile phones in particular have the possibility to detect light variations.
Yeah.
And they can detect movement. And so in this kind of detection can represent an input to the web font, the variable font in that case, and the font might react in some way. For example, changing some axes in order to be better readable in different light conditions, or movement conditions, or custom settings made by the users. For example, the user might choose to have to read at a certain font size because they have certain needs.
Yeah, which is what you can do on e-readers, you know, on the Kindle.
Exactly.
You can choose. So, yeah.
And on the other hand, you can have, for example, the possibility to change the dark mode. For example, now it's a new possibility on macOS, and you in changing in dark mode, for example, changes a lot in terms of typography. If you want to do it well, you should change the stroke dimension, so it's the readability will improve.
Yeah. The thing is, what's so it's basically it's a whole new world, and there are things that slightly worry me about it. One is that there are almost too many possibilities, and you were saying earlier as we were chatting that whatever, you know, you cannot do too much damage because you cannot stretch a font too much if the information isn't there in the file of the font. So in that way it's fine, but at the same time it sounds as if sometimes there will be designers will have much less control over the design. So that's a little bit worrying to me, because it's fine when you design, you know, if it's a book that you read and it has no images, no designed blocks, nothing, it's just typography, so that's fine, you know, knock yourself out, change whatever you want, change the font that you like, make it all caps if you know, if that rocks your boat. But when it's a website that's designed and that really needs a certain structure and so on, then changing too much does sound sometimes a bit scary. Yeah,
it is definitely it is, but well, that technology it depends on the type. It's all on the type designer's hands, because they when they design a typeface, I think they should think of it in a new way as a variable font. So they'll design it. It's a new essence, say so. It's so, and if they design it, I mean, they can do it as they used to do before, and they can leave the information in the font that is called named instances. What does it mean? You can have in the variable font the suggested parameters for the bold, the regular, the condensed, the italic, the slanted, etc. So they are what they design, and for example, the web designer can decide to use those recommendations and not to do something very weird or crazy.
Hopefully, it's the DIY people that I'm sort of slightly worried about. It's all those people that actually shouldn't be designing a website but are, and that's what I'm a tiny little bit worried about. But but I suppose, you know, that's the case. You know, we've had page builders for ages, and people have been designing websites without being designers. So, you know, we've all survived somehow. But another question I wanted to ask you might be a silly question, but it's still my question. I'll do it. I'll ask it. So where are variable fonts hosted? So are they web fonts in the sense that there are, you know, for instance, if I went Google Fonts, I know that my fonts are with Google and they give me the API code, and I do it like that, and say with Typekit and so on. Whereas with you know, at FontFace, the font file is mine. So how does it work with
the same as before, as web fonts?
Same as web.
You can use it you can
You
have
buy it from a vendor, so it'd be Typekit or somebody else. It'd be the same.
Yes, technically it's the same, because variable font is the same format as OpenType font.
Yeah.
It's OpenType font variations, the proper name of them. And so you can have it as a @font face hosted on your server, or it could be hosted by a service like typekitfonts.com or whatever. But nowadays they are not providing it yet, and Google Fonts as well. They are not providing yet. So what you can do nowadays is experimenting with the font on self-hosted. If you manage to have a variable font, because nowadays there are not so many around.
Yeah. So so I guess it's got there's a lot of pros to variable fonts. I would say that for now, I mean, all the cons that are there are really just a matter of time. Yes. Until they disappear, because the cons right now are availability, which will become, because also there's a compatibility issue. How many browsers support variable fonts? What's the browser support?
It's quite 80% nowadays. Okay. So it's really, they are here. It's not a problem of compatibility anymore. And anyway, and you can take advantage of them just right now, because you can use @support detection in CSS. So you can use variable fonts and as a fallback font regular web fonts. So if you manage to have all of them, and you won't have any problem about that. Browsers that don't support variable fonts will use the regular bold. This, how do you? Yeah. Now we call them standard fonts, standard web fonts.
Yeah.
In contrast with the variable fonts. There was Richard Rutter of Clear Left that organizes a typography conference in Brighton. And the last conference website was styled in variable fonts.
Okay, I'm definitely gonna
ampersand. It's the name of the conference.
Yeah. I'll look it up and I'll put it in the comments. So and then of course they need to sort out the licensing model and make sure that the CSS is all, you know, up to scratch and working. So do you think that with just one variable font we'll be able to fit all the needs of a project? Because what I usually say about typography also in some webinars that I've done here is I'm just saying, when in doubt, use one typeface, just one big font family that has all the weights that you need, and just use that, because you don't need, I firmly believe that is true, that you don't need more than one typeface. I use 2 on my website, obviously, having said this, but in fact, I am more and more in favor of that. So, you know, Roboto, so in theory, I think that I would say that the answer to that is yes, one variable font would fit all that. Although, if, as you say, then because of being unable to fit too many differences, it may be that you need 2, because if you need the italics of a specific font, maybe in that case.
It depends how the variable font is constructed and I think thought. For example, you might end up having one variable font with serif and sans serif version of the same font. I don't know, Museo and Museo Sans, you know, for example. Yeah. Because the 2 versions are very compatible, because they are thought compatible. Yeah. But on the other way, you might lose some advantages. One of the advantages of variable font is that it's lighter in weight. But if you put so many points and possibilities and axes, it will end up being very not so light anymore.
Yeah, well, exactly.
You decide to split it in two. It's a question of balance, linked to the weight of the font. On the other hand, the question of the weight of the fonts is going to change as well. I mean, the importance of it is going to change because browsers are going to implement font display and other CSS properties that will deal with the font loading problems. So if you have a font loading strategy, you should consider the font loading strategies together with the font weight and the choice of how many fonts you are going to use, and where those fonts are, if in 1, 2, 3 of variable fonts or regular fonts. So it's they are all linked together, these questions.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a whole new world. I mean, personally, I can't wait to start using them. I really can't wait and see how it evolves. Now we're gonna have to wrap up because it's been over an hour. So usually it's 45 minutes, but it's such a huge subject, so much to talk about. So I don't think there are any. I don't see any questions in the comments. I hope, because I'm always hoping, because it's always so weird. Facebook doesn't quite. And sometimes I end the live and then yeah, there were questions, but you don't see them anyway. I have waited. I don't think there are questions. So are you excited about variable fonts? Yes, Belinda is very excited. Lots of creative ideas. Yeah, and I mean, what a change! What a huge change since when I was like, I can't design for the web because I hate the font situation. It's such a huge change. Yeah, I'm excited. I'm really excited.
Me too, definitely, because the web fonts are already a revolution, and using them well on the web, it's still difficult. But it's an opportunity, because I've been coding a lot of websites with Verdana, Arial as well, and I was used to that, but they were very good fonts on screens, on student days.
Yeah,
have changed.
Yeah.
When I work with different fonts, it's very difficult to have a certain result. You have to try, and having the possibility to move some axes, it's going to be easier to find what you need in your page layout and page in your web settings, web type setting.
Yeah.
It's a really good opportunity.
Yeah. Belinda confirms that she was there when you know, that now it's so exciting. The future is bright, and he wasn't. You know, he was so boring designing for the web, and now it's not. So
and
fabulous.
With grid system in CSS, that's going to be linked as well.
Yeah. There's all that's a whole other world as well. That's a whole other huge.
But they're linked, world. So
they're linked. Okay. Well, next conversation will be on that then. Grids and typography. Wow, amazing. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Giulia. That was fantastic. So interesting. And you know, to be you know, to reconvene to see what changes and when, you know, what the future will bring. So great. And maybe one day we'll do a survey of all the sites that use variable fonts. So thank you so much. Thank you for all of you who've been watching and listening. Thank you very much. And the next live will be in 2 weeks. The subject, the topic is to be, and speaker are to be confirmed, but I'll let you know very, very soon. So thank you, Giulia. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.